Welcome, welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. This is the second part of our series on voices from the Puerto Rican Socialist Party and Puerto Rico's struggle for independence. The issues are long-standing, nuanced, and complicated. Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. It's neither a state nor an independent country. Officially, it's the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans have been U.S. citizens since 1917 and move freely between the island and the mainland, but as an unincorporated territory, are disenfranchised at the national level, don't vote in presidential elections, and don't have a vote in the U.S. Congress, which governs it and allows residents to elect a governor. Puerto Rico was colonized by Spain following Columbus's arrival in 1493 and remained under Spanish rule for 4 centuries. By the late 19th century, a distinct Puerto Rican identity began to emerge, centered around a fusion of indigenous, African, and European peoples. In 1898, following the Spanish-American War, the United States acquired Puerto Rico. The Puerto Rican Socialist Party, active from the late 1960s through the mid-1990s, proposed a democratic workers' republic that would tear down the curtain of silence built up to conceal U.S. colonialism on the island. The party worked to build support for Puerto Rican independence and engaged in radical progressive social change and social justice campaigns throughout the United States. Their story has largely remained untold, and we've invited the scholar activist Andres Torres to the Radical Imagination to rectify this oversight. He's the co-editor of a brilliant new book, Revolution Around the Corner, which offers a narrative from the perspective of the actual participants, members, leaders, and supporters of the party. Andreas is a distinguished lecturer at Lehman College, City University of New York. He's taught in the fields of Puerto Rican, Latino studies, labor studies, urban studies, and economics, and has written extensively on economic and socio-political trends, particularly on the persistence of racial and ethnic disparities, their sources and remedies. So, Andrea, thank you so very, very much. It's an honor, a blessing to have you on to discuss this terrific book you've co-edited, Revolution Round the Corner. And we want to get into the material and some of the key issues that you've discussed here. Perhaps at first, just tell us a little about your background and how you got involved in this project.
Okay. Well, Jim, thanks for the invitation. I should also note that I am no longer at Lehman, having retired a couple of years ago. So I'm a happily retired activist, former academic, and I'm obviously focused on telling the story of the PSP.
Exactly.
I was born in the Bronx, South Bronx, way back when, and my personal history is of a Puerto Rican family. My parents came from Puerto Rico to New York during the 1930s and 1940s. So by the time I reached my teen years and young adult years, it was evident to me that my place in this world was one of an overlooked, marginalized, and a minority, as we used to call it back in those days. And so I went through a lot of the life-changing events and traumas, as well as many New York Puerto Ricans did. And part of that process was a politicization, a radical politicization that brought me to socialism. It brought me to the Puerto Rican independence movement. And that's how I look to tie, my own work. I ended up going into academia, but that was after a period of activism and working and organizing in the Puerto Rican community, primarily in New York City.
Mm-hmm. So no one specific event radicalized you, correct? It was a process over time. What were you feeling at the time that gave you impetus to become more of an activist?
Well, yes, I wouldn't say that one singular event. That's pretty accurate, but just the accumulation of everything that I was personally experiencing. The difficulties that my parents had. I was, raised in a 4-floor tenement building after we moved out of the South Bronx into Washington Heights, and I saw how difficult it was for my old man to try to, pull together that family. But I was also obviously very influenced by so many of the other things that were going on. Now we're talking about the mid to late 60s, especially just the assassinations, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and that was, after JFK's assassination. Those were, earth-shaking events in my upbringing. And so the war, the total breakdown of what I saw was, the racism and discrimination and inequalities that Puerto Ricans and other oppressed nationalities, primarily African Americans, Puerto Ricans in New York City, always. We cohabited this city with African Americans and learned a lot from that whole experience, observing what they were going through, and saw lots of similarities to our own Puerto Rican reality. So, yes, those were, some of the influences, but it goes well beyond that, obviously, depending on individual circumstances.
Sure. What do you, just curious, what did your father, where did he work? Where did he work? What was his, how did he try
My father worked most of the years that I watched him growing up. He worked for the Love, that's Love, shirt company. He was a packer in the garment center. And so he hopped on that subway every day early, went down to the garment center. His loft factory was somewhere there in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
Around,
Seventh,
Fifth
Eighth
Avenue
Avenue.
and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
my mother started out working in a firecracker factory in making firecrackers out in Brooklyn. And then later became, the homemaker. I was fortunate in one sense. I always look back and say I was an only child. So that didn't, I think that was sort of something that didn't prevent me from, and my family from, the extremities of poverty. However, my parents were both deaf mutes. They were born profoundly deaf in Puerto Rico, and they actually, when their families arrived in New York, they met here, and I was part of a small enclave of deaf Puerto Ricans that existed throughout the city of New York. So I always say that I'm, bi and tri-cultural. I was formed in the deaf culture, the Puerto Rican deaf culture. I was always exposed to the Puerto Rican experience, and of course, the American experience. I'm part of that as well.
Yeah, interesting. And one more question on that. They left the island. Your folks left the island because of what?
They had to get out of the poverty that they were faced. My mother's family were jibaros families, as we say. They were campesinos. They lived in the mountains of Humacao, Las Piedras, that's more on the eastern side. And it was a large family. So they came to New York in stages.
Yeah.
Generations of her siblings. My father, when I say large, my mother was one of 15 siblings. My father was one of 9. And they grew up in the West Coast, in the area of San Germán, and eventually gravitated to the metropolitan San Juan area. And little by little, over the years, they came in a sort of chain migration, older siblings helping the younger ones to come.
Right. So they were
Looking for work.
Yeah, like as many other groups did, white ethnics and so on. So they're part of one of the first waves of Puerto Ricans. Would that be correct to say, coming to the mainland?
I'm doing a lot more research now on the early Puerto Rican communities right at the turn of the 20th century. But it's not until the wave of my parents, especially leading up to the 40s and 50s, that you get that, mass migration, what's called the Great Migration. Seems like many immigrant groups from around the world that come as immigrants or migrants, they come in waves, but there seem to be certain phases in their histories which are punctured by very significant mass waves, and that was the 40s and 50s. But I want to remind folks that since 1898 and before, there were Puerto Ricans coming specifically to New York City. And now we have, obviously, the most recent wave has a character of its own, a history of its own. So this is an ongoing phenomenon.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're getting a little ahead of the story here, but perhaps the 40s and 50s was a period of industrialization, wasn't it? And mechanization of agriculture, certainly in the American South, and it was going on as well in the Caribbean and Puerto Rico. So that was, wouldn't you say, part of the impetus to migrate?
Absolutely. There was that shift from the agricultural to the industrial economy that was fomented as part of a new arrangement, so to speak, that the United States and Puerto Rico established to lift. It was yet another effort to lift Puerto Rico out of its severe poverty of the 20s and 30s. And not just because of the Great Depression, but just the economy was stagnated. There was a lot of unemployment, a lot of poverty. And so part of that new arrangement, which is called the Commonwealth Government, Commonwealth Arrangement of Puerto Rico, which is still the present status of the island, part of that arrangement was to bring in U.S. capital, folks who would, manufacturers, also eventually the pharmaceuticals and so forth, who were given incentives that were not given to other capitalists in the United States at the time, to locate significant exemptions, tax exemptions, and so forth, to locate their factories, employ Puerto Ricans, and yet none of that was of a scale to, turn the economy around at a, significant level. It did help. It did sort of trickle down some of that development, some of that investment, and it did generate a more industrial working class component to the Puerto Rican economy, but it just was never at a scale enough to stem that migration from the rural areas to the migrant areas. So there was always, that overflow of folks who could just not find work, even in the new economy of the 40s and 50s. And they kept on coming until really the 60s and even early 70s. Folks were still coming, looking for work.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure the policies were designed to do exactly that, to not really create the sort of economic infrastructure for the great masses in the island, and force the migration and so on. So tell me, the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, how did you become involved with them, and how prevalent was their organizing in New York City at the time that you were growing up?
Sure. Well, the PSP, Puerto Rican Socialist Party, was actually an outgrowth of an earlier organization called the Movimiento Pro Independencia, the MPI, which actually started in 1959. In New York City, there were militants and organizers of this MPI going back to the early 60s. And then by 1969, 1970, it transforms itself from what was basically a coalition, a united front, a multi-class united front, included the nationalists, included small business folks, intellectuals, and so forth, as well as working people with an array of ideologies. On becoming the PSP, it focused on being a socialist organization. And that was at the time that I was coming to socialism, not from Puerto Rico, but from here in New York City, because of the surrounding times, you know, the various influences that I had been exposed to. And of course, any young Puerto Rican of the day would have been exposed in the media, in a lot of the discussions in the colleges and so forth that we were attending, about the need for radical change. And so the PSP came at a time evolving from what used to be an organization of older folks from Puerto Rico who realized that they needed to branch out to the next, what we call the new Rican generation, second generation Puerto Ricans. And I was part of that second generation Puerto Rican population. It was a natural for me. Of course, there were other organizations that I could have gotten involved with. I had a network of friends and associates that, you know, like me, we were in our late teens and early 20s, looking for somewhere to make a difference, as we used to say, to relate to the reality of the time. And the PSP was one of them. It was very noticeable to us. We were attracted to it because it was a force on the island. At that time already, the PSP was a major influence of radicalism on the island. And that flow of information and communication back and forth from the island to New York City and other cities in the diaspora was quite prevalent. So it was easy for us to sort of shop around and examine the different possibilities of activism, including such organizations at the Young Lords that I was familiar with and also considered getting involved with, and several other organizations and movements of the time, both in the community and in the universities and colleges that were present throughout our communities in the U.S.
Wow. Yeah, you raised a lot of questions there. So you were going to school at the time, obviously, college. Were you influenced? Were they organizing also on campuses? And were there any particular professors or that influenced you?
Yes, they were throughout the, you know, not just PSP folks. I personally wasn't influenced by PSP folks, you know, of an older generation until I got out of college and started working. I ended up working in an organization called Aspira, which is a Puerto Rican founded organization of folks who wanted to develop pathways of high school students to get into college. Aspira still exists to this day. It's celebrating some 60 odd years of existence. And I was an educational counselor. It was one of my very first jobs right out of my college. And so it was also not just young folks who wanted to be do-gooders, so to speak, and to be socially relevant, helping younger Puerto Ricans get into college, you know, with orientation, with career advice, and just sheer motivation, you know, motivating our young folks to want to go to college, and then from there to get good jobs and so forth. Most of our students that we worked with were CUNY students at the time. Brooklyn College, Lehman College, Bronx Community, City College. That's where Aspira, and by virtue of the presence of PSP at the time, many PSP activists either studied or worked in those institutions. I personally was influenced by one activist by the name of Ramon Arbona, who happened to be one of the counselors and administrators actually at Aspira. So to that extent, I did have a connection. And many of the folks that I worked with at Aspira as counselors were also connected to either the Young Lords or to the PSP or to other groups at the time. A very important other group called El Comité, based on the west side of Manhattan and well known for their anti-gentrification and squatter movement support groups, was also active at the time.
Now, just out of curiosity, were you making trips back to Puerto Rico, back and forth, or you just mainly were rooted here in New York?
When I became more active and found myself becoming, you know, so to speak, rising in the structure of the organization, I was sent oftentimes to Puerto Rico to go to meetings, to represent the PSP in the United States, to, you know, give advice about what was happening in the diaspora and so forth. And of course, I met many compañeros and compañeras of the PSP on the island, and formed lasting bonds and fraternal relations with several of those activists in the PSP. We found that some of them would end up coming to New York City as well, and to other cities of the, over time, to other cities of the PSP where the PSP was organized. So there was a lot of interaction between Puerto Ricans in the PSP in the US. We said it was a PSP branch, or as the book refers to it as La Seccional. We were the US section, the US branch of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party.
And unlike perhaps the New Left or Students for Democratic Society, which organized, at least initially, primarily on campus, your organization, you were interested in organizing, mobilizing labor unions in the workplace, community centers. Is that correct?
That's right. We were multi-sectoral in that sense. Students, workers, community residents, across the range of issues that affected our daily existence. So it was the ambition of the PSP to work across the range of daily issues that affected the community.
But also, as you explain in the book, nationally and internationally, you try to relate to liberation movements, correct? And connect there, and the influence of the Panthers, as you say, the Young Lords, and so on, and other international groups. How extensive was that during that period? We're talking now, what, in the mid to late 60s?
I'm referring primarily to the later 60s,
Later 60s, right?
into and through the 70s,
Okay.
which is sort of the peak period of the PSP. But yes, prior to that, the organization I referred to earlier as a predecessor to the PSP, the MPI, had a lot of international relations. That's where those relationships originated in terms of Puerto Rico's independence movement with African liberation movements, all the struggles in Latin America, and so forth. And prominently in the history of the PSP and of many other Puerto Rican activists going back to the early 60s is the case of Cuba. The Cuban Revolution was a primary motivating factor for many Puerto Ricans. It was an example of what a country could aspire to that was not based on capitalism and not afraid to challenge colonialism and imperialism. You can't imagine how inspirational that was to us at the time. So it was also through Cuba that many of our international relationships and connections evolved. There's a great chapter in the book, the story by Olga Sanabria, who describes coming out of El Barrio as a community activist and ending up representing the PSP and the Puerto Rican movement in the United Nations and in many, many international fora. Here in the US, the PSP also paid a lot of attention to relations with the US left. That kicked off really in the late 60s and into the 70s with several of our massive campaigns, which involved the US left and progressive movements. We learned about the left in interaction with them. We were quite unitary and ecumenical, so to speak, in terms of our relationships. We did not align ourselves with a particular left organization. We tried to emphasize to the left that Puerto Rico had to be put on their agenda, and that Puerto Ricans, deserve that sort of commitment and solidarity if the left was going to be really a left that was effective and committed to anti-imperialism.
Right. And these were heady times. I mean, revolution round the corner. It was just round the corner. So the title reflects that optimism, that headiness. The other thing I want to also bring in there is, did you also believe that a cadre of replicating what Castro did and Che in Central America and Puerto Rico, was that going to be? I'm sorry, Cuba. Was that going to be possible? Also, you thought in Puerto Rico?
Absolutely, we truly assessed that there was a whole generation of the second generation in New York had its counterpart in the generation in Puerto Rico, who were the children of the folks who ended up working in the Operation Bootstrap and so forth, which was that economic development strategy. That was a second generation in Puerto Rico that went to the universities for the first time, most of them, got educated, got politicized, and they were a source of activism, of cadre for our organization. There was an extremely important student movement called the Federación Universitaria Pro Independencia, the University Federation for Independence. The FUPI. The FUPI was an organization that was fundamental to the recruitment and positioning of future activists and cadre within the PSP and with other organizations of the left in Puerto Rico as well. So that was a main source of activism. But there were also a lot of workers who were drawn to the party, and starting in the late 60s, because the PSP decided that it had to put out a militant vision of involving and organizing within the working class. You had to dedicate resources, you had to train folks, even university graduates were recruited, so to speak, and in a term that was often used in the US left, sent out to colonize, quote, workplaces and be active within unions and that sort of thing. We in the US branch did that, but not to the extent that was occurred in Puerto Rico. We, over time, even though we were organizing in factories and within unions, we sensed over time that it was in the community and around community issues, around housing, education, health conditions, and so forth, where the fundamental, problem of oppression and exploitation of Puerto Ricans was occurring, and where the conflicts and the possibilities, where the crises was the most intense, and where there was concentration of people.
Yeah.
In the US, our folks went out working in places that were multinational and made up of different workers of different ethnicities. So it was not that straightforward to organize a Puerto Rican, concentration within a factory or in a union the way that it would be in Puerto Rico.
Could you go into that a little more specifically? Because that's really interesting. What made this more difficult? Was it the union leadership you were trying to create, or the opposition by union leaders? I'm curious as to why you weren't able to make as much progress as you wanted to at that point.
Yeah, I think it's structurally an issue. One, it's a lot easier to organize around a housing or an educational campaign in a local neighborhood. That's where everyone lives. That's where everyone eventually, closes out the day. Even if they work during the day, they're not working in the neighborhood, but there's structural advantage to organizing, doing community organizing, where there are large concentrations. And in Puerto Ricans, don't forget, back by the 60s and 70s, there were almost 1 million Puerto Ricans in New York City alone.
Yeah.
It's less nowadays, but still there are great concentrations where Puerto Ricans reside. And
Right.
even if you are side by side with other Latino populations, that sort of interaction, enables organizing around social issues, around rent strikes, around getting parents to be part of the school board, around, advocating for your children's education, around fighting against sterilization abuse and that sort of thing in the hospitals. So I think that that's partially what happened, although there's this tremendous problem of, mobility, residential mobility, because of the decrepit conditions in a lot of our communities, folks didn't often live in the same building or in the same neighborhood years upon years. But the truth was the same with jobs. In many of the more marginal industries, Puerto Ricans had to bounce around from job to job, just like African Americans did, many other Latino minorities and so forth. So in both situations, mobility is something that destabilizes the potential for organizing. But I just think that it was, easier to organize in the community than it was in local factories. And of course, union leadership wasn't excited, leave alone the boss wasn't excited about Puerto Ricans, taking leadership on their own and organizing.
Yeah, I was going to get into that. The white unions, white ethnic unions, were controlling police and teachers and so on, and firemen. So that was also part of the mix there. But is that something that the young lords picked up on? And if you want to comment, also the efforts of AOC at this community level to organize rent strikes and healthcare, taking over hospitals as the young lords did at Lincoln Hospital. At least it was 12 hours they took it over and really impacted that institution. Is that something too that is still going on today? Or how would you comment on, for example, what AOC is attempting to do now? Does she follow in that tradition or not? That you were talking
about. Now AOC is in the Congress, and she has spoken very well, I believe, on this. Once you're in and you're not on the outside, and your task and what you're going to be evaluated for or supported or opposed for is how well you deliver as a member of Congress. Once you do that, so she's not as directly involved in lots of organizing, what I would call informal organizing, activist organizing outside the outside the system. Although she is a great inspiration, and she is a guy, she's a light on what to do, and she gives lots of. And she started out her first term. You remember sitting in on Pelosi's office, supporting. I think it was green economy and so forth. So she's a special person. I'm a fan of AOC, and when you hear about the abuse and harassment and threats that she is subject to, I just want to say, folks, you may have some criticisms about the day-to-day of decisions that she has to be doing, but then tell me who else is more effective. And if you're going to say no one in Congress is effective, well, see, I've come a long way myself. The PSP in its day considered bourgeois elections as being irrelevant and counter to our goals. But you can't keep on doing the same thing, getting different, no change in results, and expect something different. You need to adapt and change it, and I have in that sense. I still consider myself a socialist, but I see the road towards true change in this country as bridging very progressive, radical politics with mobilization external to the governmental structures, streets. We have to have activity, mobilization, resistance and movement beyond the electoral arena. And I think that exactly is what is happening as we speak in this country today.
Agreed.
To the good.
Agreed. Yep. Reverend William Barber, the Poor People's Campaign, movements like that. Let's go back just for a few minutes on this independence issue again. It seems like that still is an issue that the majority, help me understand that, our audience understand that. The majority of Puerto Ricans are still not pro-independence, or what, help us understand what that issue is about for Puerto Ricans.
Right. So understand that there are three options on the table. Political options in terms of Puerto Rican status. There's statehood, there's a commonwealth in one form or another, the different versions of it that have been on the table since 1950s, and then there's independence. There are three options. So it's not a simple majority. In other words, it's not a vote between two candidates.
Right.
And so actually right now, there is no clear majority for any one of the three. The problem is for independence folks is that we still have not seen a majority expression for independence. And so how do you explain that? Or it's a challenge, without a doubt. It's a challenge. It's been historically the challenge. You start with saying, you know, what is the central fact of the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States? To me, it's the immense power, advantage, and domination that the United States has over Puerto Rico. You have to start with that. Puerto Ricans know that on the island and here. We know that the United States is incredibly dominant over Puerto Rico. It's like Russia and the Crimea. It's like China and Taiwan. It's at that level.
Right.
So your first instinct is to say, well, we have to find a way now to, you know, win over the confidence and sense of liberation among Puerto Ricans. And there are many reasons, you know, why historically, why Puerto Ricans have this sort of colonial mindset, this sense of dependency that we could never be an independent nation. That's the thinking, right? We could never be an independent nation because we're too small. If it's not that, all right, you know, we don't have the, you know, resources, which is not true at all.
Right.
So there's this sense of impossibility, which has been fed by U.S. ideology since 1898. This whole, you know what gaslighting is? It's, you know, creating a sense of lack of confidence. That's what colonial mentality is. And so that has to be broken through. And there's a long, you know, range. I could go on quite extensively about how to break through that. I don't know how much time we have.
We are unfortunately rapidly coming to an end. This hour has flown by, and there's still a couple of other things. No, I think you've explained it very, very well. I think the recent protests against the governor down there and has also begun, I think, that beginning of the end of that gaslighting and the fragmentation of memory is beginning to change. And it would be interesting to see what will happen in the near future on that. I did want to, and I also want to ask you, there are movements to lessen the economic restrictions, aren't there? Or is it beginning to lessen the economic stranglehold and the monetary debt? That's a whole other, that's a show and a half there, I know. Can you tell us about that? Gosh, we're running out of time here, but touch on that if you can. The next
Right. Well, there have been some recent measures.
Yes.
Some concessions, according to the U.S. government. The Puerto Rican independentistas have already calculated in that whatever concessions they were going to put out there, reforms, were insignificant compared to what the tasks are in the future. The latest deal still requires decades of paying off debt that is a stranglehold on resources on the island. No one believes that this is the solution that is going to, unleash the Puerto Rican economy. It's just not at all a reality. So that, to me, the latest reform of the Promesa legislation is just a media befuddling.
Got it.
Once again, to confuse the people that help is on the way.
Absolutely. Help is on the way. Well, revolution is still a possibility, perhaps not quite around the corner, but maybe a few corners to go. Thank you so very, very much for being on the show. You've really helped explain many of the issues that has concerned us here on the show. And of course, everybody needs to get this book. Where can we get this book? How can we contact you as well in your work?
I can be contacted at the following email: UZIB as in boy, LA, Uzibla at AOL. And the book can be acquired by just going to Temple University Press. There may still be a discount through their website for the book. Or of course, Amazon. I like to steer them to Temple, but if Amazon is more convenient, then fine. So those are two ways to access the book.
Terrific. It's well worth it, and we need to hear your narrative. And thank you so very, very much, Andres, for being on the show today. And God bless.
Thank you very much, Jim. Take care.
Take care. And thank you all for watching us here on The Radical Imagination. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.